There's been a lot of hysteria over the fact that Everyday Struggles like and dislike bar has been very heavy towards the dislike side, as if it's some indication that from now on, now that Joe Budden is no longer on the show, everyone will stop watching Everyday Struggle. Audiences are very fickle, especially on YouTube, especially on a platform where everything is free. People are very fickle. The Fine Brothers, about a year and a half ago, huge YouTube brand, the Fine Brothers decided to own the rights to the word react on people's videos. You might be familiar with their content. They do things like kids react to Little Pump, kids react to Little Xan, which is basically the same person. So what they basically tried to do is they tried to monopolize the word react. So if you, the person with the small YouTube channel, use the word react in your title, then they basically monetize your video. They get all the money. Of course, this is probably illegal, and the internet basically rejected it. So after the Fine Brothers decided to do that, their dislike button was dramatically just heavy on the dislike side. Like it was ridiculous. They would have 1,000 likes and maybe 20,000 dislikes. And viewers thought that this was some sort of indication that audiences weren't going to watch anymore. And it's not. Audiences are very fickle. And I think Complex is aware of that. They're aware of the fact that Joe is the strongest point of the show. Akademiks bought in the audience, as I told you guys, because you guys gave me a lot of shit about a month ago when I said that this show is centered around Ak's content. And then a lot of you threw stones at me. You said, well, Joe created the show. Semantics, it doesn't matter, because most people on the internet were looking for DJ Akademiks' opinion and not Joe Budden. A large part of the audience came into this finding out who Joe Budden was. They weren't aware of his manic behaviors. They weren't aware of his obvious narcissism, which also made him a great media personality, but they weren't aware of it. So that only indicates that most of the audience was made up of younger viewers that were Ak listeners that weren't aware of who Joe was. But nonetheless, as I said, audiences are very fickle. So before you want to get up in arms about the fact that this was done and you think that Everyday Struggle was just going to plummet, that's just not the case. Joe stated what his main beef was about leaving Complex on his podcast just yesterday. And I want to play you a clip about a potential sponsorship that Complex had with Spotify on the show. And Joe obviously wanted to be compensated for this sponsorship that was featured on a show that he created. And he's going to let you know what Complex's answer was. Check this out.
As the creator of this show, that's a problem. So Joe says, no. Know what they said? Fuck you, Joe. We'll do it without you. Know what Spotify said? Sorry, Complex. No, you won't. I'm telling you about a company that has now damaged a relationship with one of the top 3 streaming providers, creators, because I'm not talking to everyone. Everyone will not understand what Joe fights for. I'm talking to the creators. I cannot create a show and you sell the fucking properties of that show without cutting a slice to the niggas that make that fucking show possible.
So when it comes to the negotiating table, whether we're talking sports, whether we're talking music, the corporate entity will always behave as if you should be lucky that you are in their presence. That's nothing new. That's always been the case. The only difference is in sports, an athlete is protected by the collective bargaining agreement. They can protect themselves against unfair working conditions. They can also get higher pay if you're with a union. But when you're discussing something with a lawyer and just you, it's a lot harder to build that leverage. Now, obviously, I feel like Joe and everybody on the show should be compensated if Complex is having a sponsorship by a huge brand like Spotify. See, I found out through all this that Complex was owned by Verizon. I had no idea that this was the case. And that only makes Complex look even worse when they're not willing to compensate their talent. Joe may have had some petty complaints about not being able to smoke cigarettes in the bathroom. And then there was also what he pointed out, that there was somebody who was trying to sneak into the complex facilities and security did a lousy job to contain him. So that's pretty much what I'm referring to when I'm saying unsafe working conditions, which he would have the benefit of if, say, he were an athlete or he was in a union. But obviously that's not the case. But I also want to say this, even though I feel that Complex should have done everything to hold on to Joe, there is a sense that you obviously get from Joe, which is that he's very bitter about everything. He's bitter about Def Jam. He's bitter about his music career as a whole. So at what point is this really about you being compensated for services rendered at the present moment, or you simply getting reparations for what you felt like you've deserved over the past 10 years? Those amounts, or whatever conditions that you would like to have. Maybe Joe wanted some sort of ownership of the show because he kept saying on his podcast that he created the show. So maybe he wants to step into, more of an equity situation where he gets a lump sum of what the show generates, and Complex, gladly told him to go fuck himself. We don't know exactly what it is, and on the podcast, he didn't really specify any numbers, which I think is in poor taste. I think that's fine if you don't tell everybody the details of what you wanted. I think that's a lot better. It's a lot better to be vague in those situations because, in my opinion, it's a bit classless. But will you continue to watch Everyday Struggle in 2018 now that Joe isn't a part of the show? I've heard a lot of people say that Lord Jamar should come on the show, and that would be an interesting dynamic. I, for one, think that Lord Jamar I think he'd be more of a sober version of Joe. I think most of what Lord Jamar had to get out, he already got that out on those DJ Vlad installments. I don't really think like he's really in his content creation prime anymore like he was 2 to 3 years ago. I had one thought about maybe Nori taking over that slot, but I do remember that Nori was on the show for a Friday episode, and Nori just seems like he's too agreeable, I think. Anyone who has to line up with Akademiks has to be someone who is a disagreeable person, because Ak is an agreeable person. He tends to be naive at certain points. He gives people the benefit of the doubt, which is fine, but the antithesis of that has to be someone who says, no, I am cynical, I do not believe it. It doesn't have to be somebody as extreme as Joe is, but it has to be someone that meets it somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily think that it has to be a rapper. I don't think that. If I'm not mistaken, I think originally the show was supposed to have Elliot Wilson as the co-host along with Joe. But obviously it works a lot better if it is a rapper, because obviously, like most of these sports shows, the dynamic works well because you have the media personality and then you have the person who's been there. You have the athlete. So this is going in that same vein. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like that, but it works a lot better if it is. But once again, will you watch Everyday Struggle in 2018 without Joe? Please let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you guys next time.